Welcome, beloved anointed ones. The loudest threat is never the real danger. It's the one that stops making noise because it already won. Most people think power looks like chaos, shouting, rituals, numbers, and drama. History says otherwise. Every major collapse, empires, cults, secret groups, psychological operations, didn't fall because of brute force. They fell because one person refused to play the role assigned to them. One mind stepped outside the script, and the entire system started malfunctioning. That is not mythology. That is pattern analysis. Here's the uncomfortable fact. Groups that rely on secrecy, manipulation, or fear always overestimate their strength and underestimate clarity. They mistake coordination for intelligence. They mistake numbers for dominance. Studies in behavioral psychology show that groups bonded by fear make riskier decisions, become emotionally reactive, and crumble faster when their target stops responding the way the group expects. In simple terms, once the target stops panicking, the group starts doing it for them. That's when things get sloppy. That's when mistakes show up in plain sight. Now add a little irony. A whole gang gathers, whispering, plotting, watching, feeding off each other's paranoia. And the person they're focused on is out here living their life, growing, evolving, minding their business. That's not just embarrassing. That's terrifying for them. Because power doesn't disappear loudly. It disappears awkwardly. One day, the spell doesn't work, the pressure doesn't land, and suddenly everyone in the room is looking at each other like, wait, why isn't this working? What makes this situation dangerous for them isn't confrontation. It's exposure. When one person operates from internal alignment instead of fear, every artificial structure around them starts showing cracks. The masks slip, the coordination weakens, the confidence evaporates. And the funniest part? They don't even realize when the shift happens. They just know something feels off, control feels shaky, and the target they once underestimated is no longer reachable. This isn't a story about force. It's a story about miscalculation, about how a group prepared for a fight they never actually got, about how one grounded individual became the unexpected variable that ruined the entire plan, without raising their voice, breaking their character, or losing their sense of self. And that's exactly where their fear begins. Number one, you didn't fight them on their level, you outgrew the battlefield. They were ready for a fight. That's the part people don't understand. They prepared for chaos, noise, emotional reactions, and messy back-and-forth energy. They built their entire strategy around provoking you into showing up where they felt strongest. What shocked them wasn't resistance. It was your absence from the battlefield they created. When you stopped reacting the way they expected, the whole structure fell apart. Not slowly, immediately. Systems built on manipulation need engagement to survive. The moment you no longer fed their narrative, they lost the ability to control the direction of the story. You didn't dodge the battle because you were afraid. You walked past it because you saw it clearly. Outgrowing the battlefield means realizing that not every challenge is meant to be confronted head-on. Some are designed to trap you in endless cycles of explanation, defense, and emotional exhaustion. You recognized that early. Instead of trying to prove strength, you shifted focus to growth. While they stayed busy plotting moves, you changed the rules by refusing to play the same game. That decision unsettled them more than any attack ever could. People who depend on control panic when their target becomes unresponsive to manipulation. They don't know how to operate without resistance. Your calm wasn't weakness, it was understanding. You understood that true power doesn't rush toward conflict, it moves beyond it. What made this even more unsettling is that you didn't announce your exit. You didn't argue. You didn't explain. You simply evolved. One day, they looked up and realized the battlefield was empty. No opponent. No reactions. no emotional leverage, just silence where dominance was supposed to be. That's when fear crept in, not because you fought harder, but because you no longer needed to fight at all. You didn't win by overpowering them, you won by becoming unreachable, and once someone outgrows the environment designed to contain them, there is nothing a group can do to pull them back. That's not escape. That's mastery. Number 2, they needed numbers, because none of them had identity. What makes a gang of manipulators or witches feel powerful isn't their skill. It's the illusion of strength that comes from numbers. Alone, each of them is fragile, insecure, and easily cracked. But together, they borrow confidence from one another, creating a fake ecosystem of control. That borrowed power is always unstable, because it isn't rooted in self. The moment you confront a system like that with someone who has real identity, it collapses quietly but completely. They spend so much energy coordinating, plotting, whispering, and rehearsing moves because they can't stand alone. Every glance, every ritual, every group meeting is a patch over an emptiness they fear facing by themselves. They rely on crowd momentum to cover their weaknesses, and the minute that momentum disappears, they realize they never had a backbone. You, on the other hand, didn't need a crowd to define who you are. That's why you were untouchable. You didn't borrow confidence. You generated it. You didn't perform identity. You embodied it. Because you weren't tied to their energy, every attempt to manipulate you became useless. They could scream in unison, coordinate attacks, and try to overwhelm you with sheer presence, but nothing landed. You didn't bend. You didn't break. You didn't respond the way they expected. Their numbers, which were supposed to intimidate, ended up highlighting how hollow each individual really was. What terrified them the most is the subtle realization that identity isn't transferable. You can't borrow it from someone else. You can't conjure it in a crowd. It either exists or it doesn't. And their lack of it made them predictable, weak, and ultimately scared. They are forced to confront the truth every time a singular force like you moves through their world untouched, self-contained, and whole. They can gather 100 voices, but one rooted soul can erase their collective threat without ever raising a hand. That's the ultimate leverage, the invisible dominance that no number can overcome. Number 3, you became unpredictable by becoming honest with yourself. What broke them wasn't a fight, it wasn't strategy, it wasn't even the calm or the restraint. It was the fact that you became impossible to predict because you became honest with yourself. Before that, they could study you, manipulate your emotions, anticipate your reactions. They thrived on patterns and predictable energy. But the moment you stopped lying to yourself, everything changed. You stopped performing for approval, stopped reacting to triggers, and stopped giving them the emotional breadcrumbs they depended on. That unpredictability isn't chaos, it's clarity. It's alignment with truth that cannot be manipulated. Being honest with yourself means you no longer needed their scripts to define you. Their attacks, whispers, rituals, and orchestrated chaos all relied on you stepping into the trap they built. They expected confusion, hesitation, or anger. Instead, you acted from a grounded understanding of who you are and what you will and won't tolerate. Every move you made became autonomous, and that autonomy was alien to them. They had trained themselves to read people like open books. Then suddenly, the book closed. What they didn't realize is that honesty with yourself isn't just self-awareness. It's armor. It removes the hooks that others try to use. They cannot shake what isn't shaken. They cannot provoke what isn't provoked. Every tactic they relied on to control or scare you became useless, and in that moment, their fear became louder than any noise they could make. And here's the ironic twist that made it even worse for them. Becoming honest with yourself doesn't feel like power. It feels natural. It feels like breathing. But for them, who spent every day building illusions and hiding behind borrowed energy, that naturalness was terrifying. They had nothing to anchor their attacks to. You became unpredictable because your choices no longer needed their input. You became untouchable because you were no longer a player in their game. You didn't just break the pattern, you erased it, leaving them scrambling in the wake of someone who finally sees clearly, acts clearly, and no longer fits into any expectation. That clarity alone dismantles fear, and it terrifies manipulators more than any fight ever could. Number 4, they lost control the moment you stopped needing approval. Their entire power structure depended on one simple thing: your reaction. Every whisper, every manipulation, every calculated move was designed to get you to bend, to doubt yourself, to seek validation from them. They thrived on your uncertainty, feeding off your need for approval like it was oxygen. The moment you stopped giving it to them, the air went out of their system. That's when panic set in. That's when fear became visible in their eyes. You didn't announce it. You didn't make a show of independence. You simply stopped caring what they thought. Approval, recognition, or acceptance, none of it mattered anymore. And for a group built entirely around external influence, that's catastrophic. They had been playing a game in which the rules required you to participate emotionally, and suddenly you opted out. When the target refuses to play by their expectations, the entire strategy crumbles. What once looked intimidating becomes meaningless, and what once seemed safe starts to unravel. This isn't about being cold or detached. It's about clarity and self-possession. When you no longer seek approval, no manipulation sticks. Threats, flattery, pressure. It all slides off because you are anchored internally. They lose the only tool they ever had against you, your response. And they feel it. You can see it in how they second-guess themselves, how they scramble to regain momentum, how their confidence begins to wobble. They realize too late that control wasn't in their hands. It was in yours, and you never handed it over. Stopping the need for approval doesn't just neutralize their influence, it flips the power dynamic entirely. You are no longer a participant in their hierarchy. You are outside it, untouchable, unshakable. They panic because they can't manipulate what doesn't yield, and no amount of coordination, noise, or intimidation can change that. That is why they are scared. Not because you struck them down or showed aggression, but because you reclaimed your autonomy completely. Once someone reaches that level, fear becomes the only response left for those who ever thought they could control them. Number 5, you didn't absorb their darkness. You refused to enter it. What made them panic wasn't that you fought them. It wasn't that you outsmarted them. It was that you refused to play by their rules. They thrive on dragging people into darkness, fear, deception, envy, chaos. That's their environment, their comfort zone, and their weapon. They assumed that anyone who crossed them would be drawn in, forced to absorb the toxicity, and eventually break. But you didn't. You stayed clean. You stayed whole. That refusal alone disarmed them completely. They tried to provoke anger, jealousy, confusion, or doubt. Every whisper, every scheme, every attack was designed to make you participate in their darkness, and every time they failed, their fear grew. Darkness cannot tolerate boundaries. It cannot survive when it encounters clarity and strength that doesn't conform. You were the anomaly they couldn't explain, the variable that didn't fit into their calculations. They had been counting on your compromise, and when it didn't come, their sense of control evaporated. This is the kind of power most people never recognize. It doesn't show up as aggression or confrontation. It shows up as self-possession and refusal. By staying true to yourself and refusing to absorb the negative energy they projected, you created an unshakable armor. You became untouchable not because you fought, but because you didn't have to. Their darkness, which had terrified countless others, bounced off you like it hit a wall. And that's what scared them more than anything else. They realized that all their tactics relied on others lowering themselves to survive in their toxic game. You didn't lower yourself. You didn't compromise. You didn't even bend toward fear. And in that moment, the gang, the witches, the manipulators, they saw themselves clearly for the first time. Their power depended on the participation of others, and without it, they were powerless. You didn't just withstand their attacks. You exposed the emptiness of their system and walked through unshaken, leaving them scrambling to understand why nothing worked. That's the real terror. A presence so clean, so anchored, so untouchable, that their entire world no longer applies. Number 6. They were united by fear. You were anchored by truth. Their strength looked impressive from a distance. A group of people moving in sync, whispering plans, reinforcing each other's insecurities. But their unity was a house built on sand. The foundation was fear. Fear of exposure, fear of weakness, fear of losing control. They needed each other to feel safe, to convince themselves that their power was real. The moment one faltered, the entire structure wobbled. Their cohesion wasn't born from purpose, vision, or principle. It was borrowed energy, and borrowed energy always collapses when it's tested against someone grounded. You were different because your anchor wasn't borrowed. You weren't connected to anyone else's panic, deception, or manipulation. You weren't feeding off their rhythm, your decisions, your strength, your reactions. They all came from truth. Truth doesn't wobble. Truth doesn't panic. Truth doesn't need validation. And that difference is a kind of power most manipulators can't comprehend. When a group is fueled by fear, even a single unshakable presence becomes a threat. You didn't need to attack them. You didn't need to shout. You simply existed in alignment with yourself, and that was enough to dismantle their influence. Every coordinated move they made against you backfired, because fear can only project power onto those who feel it. When someone refuses to internalize the anxiety and manipulation, it becomes a mirror, reflecting their weakness instead. They scramble to maintain control, but control is meaningless when the target doesn't play the game. What scared them wasn't confrontation. It was clarity. It was someone who refused to be shaken by what they thought was intimidating. Being anchored by truth doesn't feel like a weapon. It feels like normal life. But for people who have built entire systems on illusion, it's terrifying. Every whisper they sent your way, every attempt to unsettle you, every plan meant to trap you, it failed. And their fear grew not because they were exposed, but because they realized that the very thing they had counted on to dominate, to manipulate, and to scare simply didn't exist in you. That absence is far more destabilizing than anything they could do. You didn't fight them. You didn't bend. You didn't break. You were anchored by truth, and that made all the difference. Number 7, your consistency exposed their chaos. They thrive on unpredictability, shifting motives, and confusion. That's their entire playbook: manipulate, provoke, and create doubt. Every story they spun, every reaction they tried to provoke, every plan they executed relied on the assumption that you would bend, stumble, or at least react emotionally. They count on chaos to give them leverage. And then you showed up consistent. Not loud, not aggressive, not flashy, just steady, unwavering, and predictable in the sense that your integrity never wavered. That consistency didn't make you easy to manipulate. It made them look ridiculous. Consistency is a quiet kind of power they never prepare for. While they were scrambling to control the narrative, switching stories and motives like changing masks at a masquerade, you didn't flinch. Your responses didn't give them ammunition. Your energy didn't feed their fear. And every time they tried to corner you, every attempt to destabilize or confuse, it failed. Their chaos became obvious, glaring, and inescapable. To anyone watching, it would look like a train wreck happening in real time, except the wreck was self-inflicted. They were unraveling in front of their own eyes because your steadiness highlighted the emptiness of their actions. This is what truly terrified them. Not confrontation, not strategy, not even retaliation. It was the fact that the pattern they depended on, your reaction, no longer existed. Your predictability in self-mastery exposed their unpredictability in morality. Their frantic schemes, manipulations, and whisper campaigns were all laid bare. They realized their control was a lie, a flimsy structure held together only by the fact that most people would bend under the pressure. You didn't bend, you didn't perform, you just remained steady. And that's why numbers, rituals, and intimidation failed. Chaos cannot survive against consistency. A single steady force unmasks an entire network of instability. Their power, once threatening, becomes absurd in comparison. While they spun in circles, you moved forward, untouched, untangled, and untouchable. Every action they took to shake you only revealed more about their own fear, their own insecurity, and their own inability to match the force of a mind that refuses to waver. That is the real kind of dominance that terrifies manipulators. Quiet, unwavering, and absolute. Number 8. They thought you were isolated, not self-contained. They assumed you were alone, disconnected, and therefore vulnerable. That's the mistake everyone makes when dealing with people like you. They see solitude and mistake it for weakness. They think a single person without visible allies must be easier to manipulate, easier to intimidate, easier to control. What they didn't realize is that you weren't isolated. You were self-contained. You didn't need validation, support, or energy from anyone else because you had already built everything internally. Your power didn't come from numbers or influence. It came from mastery over yourself. That distinction is terrifying to anyone who relies on borrowed strength. Being self-contained is invisible power. They could circle around you, whisper, plot, or try to provoke reactions, and every tactic fell flat. Isolation would have made you a target, but self-containment made you untouchable. Every attempt to manipulate you hit a wall because your foundation wasn't external. You didn't need their recognition, their fear, or their submission to feel complete. And that made them scramble in ways they didn't expect. Their strategies, which were designed to overwhelm, confuse, or corner, ended up highlighting their own deficiencies. What made it even worse for them is that self-containment looks effortless. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, and its quiet presence exposes everything built on dependency. Their control, which relied on exploiting reactions, vanished. Their coordination, which relied on fear of numbers, collapsed. They realized, too late, that you were never their target in the way they imagined. They weren't dealing with someone vulnerable or reactive. They were dealing with someone who had already removed themselves from the rules of their game. That shift, from being perceived as isolated to being undeniably self-contained, is what breaks groups like that. They panic not because you are aggressive, but because you cannot be reached, bent, or used. They try to pull strings, but the strings no longer exist. You are an entirely different variable, operating outside their system, and that reality terrifies anyone who built their identity on fear, control, and borrowed power. Number 9. They tried to study you, but ended up studying themselves. Every move they made was calculated. Every whisper, every ritual, every plan was meant to dissect you, predict you, control you. They thought they were observing a target, but what happened instead was far more revealing. They ended up confronting their own weaknesses. The more they tried to understand you, the more the reflection of their own insecurities stared back at them. Their envy, their paranoia, their hunger for dominance, all of it became visible under the microscope they aimed at you. And that's when panic set in. They assumed they could map your mind, anticipate your decisions, and bend your reactions to fit their narrative. They thought a single person could be contained, predicted, and ultimately defeated if the right pressure points were found. But you didn't operate on their rules. Your clarity, your alignment, your self-possession created a space they couldn't enter. And as they scrambled to decode you, each attempt highlighted how little control they actually had over themselves. Every strategy they applied was a mirror showing their own limitations. They weren't studying your patterns, they were confronting the emptiness of their own. That realization is crushing to someone built on fear and manipulation. You don't have to fight someone who refuses to be understood on their terms. You don't have to argue or prove anything. The more they tried to force a response from you, the more their own flaws were amplified. Their unity, their coordination, their supposed superiority, all of it began to unravel because they were trying to dominate someone who existed outside their system entirely. By the end, they weren't just scared of you. They were unsettled by what they saw in themselves, exposed and amplified by the reflection you inadvertently created. They realized that the only thing they had ever controlled was their own perception of power, and that perception had just been shattered. You didn't need to attack them or reveal your own strength. Your mere presence forced them to confront the chaos inside themselves. That is a power they cannot calculate, and that is why their fear became louder than anything they could have thrown at you. Number 10, they confused calm with submission, a fatal error. They made the classic mistake of reading your calm as weakness. To them, a lack of aggression meant an opportunity, a chance to push harder, to dominate, to force you into a reaction. But what they didn't understand is that calm is not a lack of force. Calm is controlled power. Calm is clarity in motion, a grounded presence that refuses to be moved by chaos or threat. And when manipulators mistake that for submission, it becomes a fatal error. They thrived on emotional responses. Every whisper, every attack, every attempt at intimidation was designed to provoke you, to get you to act in ways that could be used against you. They counted on your tension, your anger, your confusion, because those reactions gave them leverage. But you refused to play their game. Your calm was a statement of mastery. You weren't off balance, you weren't cornered, you weren't performing. You were observing, calculating, and moving in a way that kept you untouchable while leaving them scrambling. What terrifies manipulators the most is someone they cannot predict. Calm doesn't just neutralize attacks, it exposes them. Every scheme, every plot, every attempt to control becomes transparent when it collides with someone who refuses to react. Their chaos, which they rely on to dominate, suddenly looks foolish. Their coordination becomes frantic. Their intimidation, ineffective. And they realize too late that the quiet one isn't weak. They are operating from a higher level of awareness, a place they cannot reach. This is why their fear escalates. Calm doesn't just protect you, it destabilizes them. The more they try to provoke, the more they reveal their flaws. Their confidence, built on the assumption that everyone will respond emotionally, collapses. And the irony is that you didn't even have to act. You didn't have to prove strength or attack. You simply remained steady, anchored, and unshakable. That quiet mastery is more threatening than aggression because it leaves them exposed, helpless, and increasingly frantic. Mistaking calm for submission is the moment they realize the battlefield isn't theirs to command. It never was. Number 11. You didn't break their spell. You starved it. Their power relied entirely on feeding off your energy, attention, and reactions. Every whisper, every scheme, every ritual was designed to provoke, to pull you into their orbit, to make you respond emotionally so they could claim control. That was their spell, a carefully constructed system that only worked if you participated. And you didn't. You refused to engage, refused to react, and in doing so you starved it. Without your energy, without your fear, without your validation, their carefully built world started to collapse. This is what makes manipulators panic. They can tolerate confrontation, noise, and even defiance. But what terrifies them is indifference, a refusal to fuel their illusions. You didn't need to fight them. You didn't need to prove strength or strike back. You simply withheld the very thing they required to exist, your emotional response. And without it, all their tactics, all their coordination, all their projected power became meaningless. Starvation works silently, invisibly, but it is far more devastating than attack. Their panic grows as they realize their influence is evaporating. Every plan, every manipulation, every threat, useless. They scramble to regain momentum, but you are untouchable, self-contained, and impervious to their energy. The more they try to provoke, the more obvious it becomes that their power has always depended on you reacting. They discover that their intimidation, control, and fear tactics were only alive when you engaged with them. Without you feeding the spell, it dies, and that revelation terrifies them. What makes it even more destabilizing is that starving their spell doesn't feel like power to you. It's just self-preservation, clarity, and presence. But for them, it is catastrophic. They are forced to confront the fragility of everything they built on manipulation and fear. One by one, their illusions crumble, not because of aggression, but because you refuse to be a participant in their system. And in that absence, they realize too late that the spell has already failed, leaving them exposed, frantic, and completely powerless. You didn't just survive. You dismantled them quietly, invisibly, and irreversibly. Number 12. They realized too late that you were the pattern breaker. Their entire operation depended on predictability. Every tactic, every whisper, every scheme relied on the assumption that people respond in certain ways under pressure. They were comfortable because they had studied the rules of human behavior, learned the patterns, and built a system that made them feel untouchable. Then you came along and shattered it without warning. You didn't just defy their expectations, you made the rules irrelevant. That is the moment panic sets in. That is the moment fear replaces confidence. Being a pattern breaker doesn't mean you acted recklessly or aggressively. It means you moved in alignment with yourself, without bending to the rhythms they set. They tried to map you, predict you, provoke you, and every attempt failed because you weren't operating under the assumptions they relied on. Their calculations, their coordination, their carefully rehearsed strategies became useless. They didn't just misjudge you. They failed to recognize that the very system they depended on couldn't contain someone like you. That realization is crushing, because it exposes the fragility of everything they built on control and manipulation. What terrifies manipulators most is unpredictability that comes from grounded clarity. You weren't reacting, overreacting, or pretending. You were simply consistent with your truth. And in doing so, you revealed the cracks in their structure. Every attempt to regain control only emphasized their failure. Their unity, which once felt intimidating, began to look chaotic. Their confidence, which once seemed solid, started to wobble. And as they scrambled to re-establish dominance, they realized that you had already rewritten the rules of engagement without ever raising your voice or breaking your integrity. By the time they understood what had happened, it was too late. They had been operating on the assumption that you were like everyone else, that you could be predicted, manipulated, or provoked. But you weren't. You were the anomaly, the unplanned variable, the one who refused to fit into their system. That is the true source of their fear. They weren't just losing control. They were losing the ability to understand reality itself. And that is why a single, grounded individual can dismantle a group of manipulators faster than any confrontation ever could. Number 13. They lost the war the moment you refuse to hate them. Hatred is a leash that keeps people tied to their enemies, their circumstances, and their chaos. It's the fuel that manipulators count on to trap their targets in endless cycles of reaction, revenge, and emotional investment. They believe that anger, resentment, or fear would make you vulnerable, force you to engage, and ultimately give them leverage. What they didn't account for is that you refused to hate. You didn't feed the cycle. You didn't fuel their narrative. You didn't give them the emotional energy they depended on. That refusal alone broke their system. By refusing to hate, you stepped entirely outside of their control. They expected reactions, they expected chaos, and they expected you to play the game of emotion they had perfected. Instead, you acted from clarity, purpose, and truth. Your calm, your neutrality, and your self-possession became the force that undermined every strategy they deployed. They had counted on you taking the bait, lashing out, or internalizing the negativity, but you didn't. Without emotional participation, their attacks became meaningless and their power evaporated quietly but completely. What terrifies manipulators more than confrontation is absence. Absence of reaction, absence of fear, absence of hate. When you refused to hate, you removed the only link they had to influence you. Every whisper, every scheme, every attempt to provoke became futile. They were left scrambling to understand why the plan they had built for years wasn't working. Their confidence crumbled because they realized their strength was never theirs. It was borrowed from the reactions they expected from you. Refusing to hate doesn't make you passive. It makes you untouchable. It transforms the battlefield into a place where they are exposed, frantic, and disoriented, while you move forward with freedom and clarity. They are powerless because their entire strategy hinged on an emotional response that never came. And in that silence, in that refusal to participate in their chaos, you won the war. Not with force, not with aggression, but with a truth they could never manipulate, control, or destroy. That is why your presence terrifies them more than any attack ever could. Number 14. You didn't defeat them. You outlived their relevance. They were confident that their tactics, their schemes, and their intimidation would define the outcome. They expected drama, confrontation, and reaction. They thought that survival depended on fighting them, proving strength, or showing dominance. But you did something far more powerful. You outlived their relevance. You didn't need to engage, to argue, or to prove yourself. You simply moved beyond the framework they built around you, and in doing so, you made their power obsolete. This is the kind of mastery they cannot comprehend. Their influence depended entirely on your engagement, your fear, your doubt, your emotional energy. Without it, their rituals, their plots, and their coordinated attacks lost all meaning. Every tactic that once seemed threatening became trivial. Every strategy that once demanded attention became irrelevant. You weren't reacting, and that lack of reaction exposed the emptiness at the core of everything they relied on. Their presence mattered only as long as you allowed it to matter. Once you removed yourself from their system, the entire battlefield changed. What makes this terrifying for them is the invisibility of your power. You didn't have to announce your victory or flaunt your dominance. You didn't need noise or confrontation to prove that you were untouchable. You simply existed outside of their influence, and that quiet detachment undermined every assumption they ever made. They realized too late that control, fear, and intimidation only work when the target participates. By refusing to participate, you rewrote the rules entirely. Outliving their relevance doesn't require force. It requires alignment with yourself and the refusal to allow external chaos to dictate your energy. They are left scrambling, frantic, and unmoored because the one person they thought they could define has simply moved on. Their threats, their fear, and their coordination cannot reach you. You didn't just survive, you transcended their system. That is the true source of their terror. A presence so whole, so anchored, and so self-contained that their entire operation becomes meaningless. You outlived them, and in that quiet supremacy, you won in a way they will never recover from. Conclusion. At the end of the day, the story isn't about fights won, battles staged, or attention seized. It's about a truth so profound that it cannot be measured in noise, numbers, or force. It's about a presence so grounded that chaos around it becomes irrelevant. Every point we've explored, from refusing to enter their darkness, to starving their spells, to outliving their relevance, reveals the same undeniable truth. Real power doesn't compete. Real power doesn't argue, push, or perform. Real power exists quietly, unshakably, anchored in clarity, self-possession, and alignment with truth. Groups, gangs, or manipulators build systems designed to control, provoke, and intimidate. They rely on borrowed strength, fear, and the participation of their targets. But when someone refuses to play their game, refuses to react, refuses to feed the system, everything they relied on collapses from the inside out. One person who knows who they are, moves with consistency, and acts from internal authority exposes the fragility of their world. They panic not because you attacked them, but because their entire relevance depended on your engagement, and you removed yourself from it. Every manipulation, every tactic, every whisper falls flat in the face of someone who refuses to participate in chaos. And here is the final, unshakable point. Victory isn't in confrontation, it's in transcendence. You didn't defeat them by force. You didn't fight on their battlefield. You didn't allow fear, hate, or doubt to dictate your energy. You simply evolved, remained self-contained, and let their influence fade into irrelevance. That is what makes them terrified. That is what makes one person unstoppable against 100 manipulators. And that is why, when the dust settles, you don't just survive, you emerge untouchable, undeniable, and beyond their comprehension. If you felt the weight of this, if this opened your eyes to how power and clarity operate in a world built on manipulation, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more insights that go deeper than anyone else dares. Hit the like button, share this with someone who needs to see it, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or experiences. Every view, every comment, every share helps us expose the truth that most people are too blind to see. Stay sharp, stay anchored, and keep rising above the chaos. God bless you.